Everybody. Today I'll guide you through how to memorize the thenar and hypothenar muscles. So firstly, let's understand what are thenar and hypothenar muscles. So let's say this is the palmar aspect of the hand. This is the thumb, while this is the pinky finger. So the muscles that are associated here, that are present here, are called thenar muscles, while the muscles present here are called the hypothenar muscles. Now a short trick to remember that the muscles close to the thumb are thenar is that thumb starts with TH and thenar starts with TH. Therefore thenar muscles are close to the thumb and the hypothenar is then close to the pinky finger. Now since the thenar muscles are closely associated with the thumb, therefore the thenar muscles will have the word pollicis in them, which is Latin for thumb. Whereas the hypothenar muscles are closely located near the pinky, therefore they will be associated with movement of the pinky finger and therefore they'll have the word digiti minimi, which means nothing but the little finger in the hypothenar muscles. Now whenever we learn the thenar and hypothenar muscles, we must always correlate them and learn them together so that we understand the similarities and differences they possess, which makes it much easier for us to memorize and to learn these muscles. And that's exactly what we're going to do in today's video. We're going to learn the thenar and hypothenar muscles, correlate them and understand their similarities and differences. So we are going to learn the thenar and hypothenar muscles with the help of this table. So we are going to fill in this table. So let's talk about the thenar and hypothenar muscles. There are 4 thenar muscles and there are 4 hypothenar muscles, of which 3 thenar and 3 hypothenar muscles have similarities, whereas there is 1 thenar and hypothenar muscle that differ from each other. So let's start. So the first thenar muscle that we talk about will be opponens. Opponens. Since it's a thenar muscle, therefore it will have pollicis, which is the thumb. Opponens, pollicis. Similarly, we have the hypothenar muscle, opponens, since it's a hypothenar muscle, it will have the word digiti minimi. So opponens pollicis in the thenar muscle group and the opponens digiti minimi in the hypothenar muscle group. The next muscle that we have is the abductor muscle. So we have the abductor pollicis. And since we have an abductor longus muscle, we'll also add the suffix brevis over here to state that this is a shorter muscle. So the abductor pollicis longus muscle is a forearm muscle, but then the abductor pollicis brevis muscle is a palm muscle. Similarly, we have an abductor here. And since it's a hypothenar muscle, it will have the words digiti minimi. The next muscle that we are going to talk about is going to be the flexor muscle. Flexor pollicis, and here we'll add the suffix brevis to indicate that it's a shorter version because there is a longus counterpart to the flexor pollicis muscle. Therefore, we add the suffix brevis over here, which indicates it's a thenar muscle. Similarly, we'll have a flexor digiti minimi. Now the last 2 muscles would be the muscles that do not correlate with one another, which means these are different muscles. So for thenar muscles, we have the abductor pollicis. Whereas for the hypothenar muscles, we'll have palmaris brevis muscle. So now that we're done with the naming of the thenar and hypothenar muscles and we've seen a similarity in their names, there's one more similarity that we must note. Each one of them will originate from the flexor retinaculum except one of the thenar and one of the hypothenar. So for the origin, let's write flexor retinaculum in each of them. Flexor retinaculum, 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 flexor retinaculum. Alright. So now which are the two muscles that do not originate from the flexor retinaculum? So first we'll talk about the hypothenar muscles here, okay? So any muscle that starts with A does not originate from the flexor retinaculum. So when we notice these muscles that are the hypothenar muscles, we only see one that starts with A, which is the abductor digiti minimi. And therefore the abductor digiti minimi does not originate from the flexor retinaculum. So we know that the abductor digiti minimi of the hypothenar muscles does not originate from the flexor retinaculum. Now there is one thenar muscle as well which does not originate from the flexor retinaculum. Now here when we move to the thenar muscle, we face a dilemma because we have two muscles that start with A. Now how do we know which one of these do not originate from the flexor retinaculum? So we've seen that the hypothenar muscle observes the abductor digiti minimi which does not originate from the flexor retinaculum. Hence, in the thenar muscle group, the abductor pollicis brevis, that is the abductor muscle of the thenar muscle, will compensate for the abductor muscle in the hypothenar muscle group not originating from the flexor retinaculum, and hence the abductor muscle in the thenar group will originate from the flexor retinaculum. Therefore, the adductor, which is the other one which starts with A, will not originate from the flexor retinaculum. So we have the abductor digiti minimi that starts with A will not originate with from the flexor retinaculum. Now to compensate for the abductor digiti minimi, the abductor pollicis brevis will originate from the flexor retinaculum, whereas the next one with A from the thenar muscle group, which is the adductor pollicis, will not originate from the flexor retinaculum. So we've got the origin from the flexor retinaculum clear. Now let's talk about the insertion. So we have opponents, abductor, flexor that are common in thenar and hypothenar muscle groups. So let's first talk about the abductor and flexors, okay, and their insertion. The abductors and flexors have the same insertion points, which are the proximal phalanx. So proximal phalanx Now, since opponents, which means opposing, since opponents opposes everything, the opponents will have common insertion points, but they will differ from the adductor and flexor muscles. So the opponents will insert on the metacarpal. The flexor and the abductor will insert at the proximal phalanx, while the opponents will insert at the metacarpal. So let's talk about the insertion of the adductor pollicis and the palmaris brevis. The adductor pollicis will also follow the abductor and flexor, and insert on the proximal phalanx. But the palmaris brevis is the only muscle that will not insert onto any bone, and it will insert on the dermis. So we have the insertions all clear. Now let's talk about adding onto the list of origins. So firstly we'll talk about the opponent's pollicis. To understand this a bit more clearly, I'll draw a rough diagram of the hand. So here I'm drawing the 8 carpal bones. Here I'm drawing the metacarpals. These are the proximal phalanx. These are the middle phalanx. Remember, the thumb does not have a middle phalanx. And these are the distal phalanx. Alright. So now let's talk about the opponent's pollicis. Before talking about the opponent's pollicis, let's name the carpal bones. So we have the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, the pisiform, the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, the hamate. So first we talk about the opponent's pollicis, and therefore we know it will be associated with this finger because this is the thumb. So the opponent's pollicis is associated with the thumb. Therefore it will be located on this side. So it originates on the trapezium and it inserts on the metacarpal. Because it opposes everything, it inserts on the metacarpal. So let's add that. It originates on the trapezium. The opponent's digiti minimi will originate on the same line but on the digiti minimi side of it. Therefore, it originates on the hook of the hamate, inserting onto metacarpal. So here we write hook of hamate. So if you notice their origin and insertion points when we learn them as a table is quite similar. So just memorizing this diagram that I draw on the right will be sufficient for you to remember where these muscles originate and insert. Now let's talk about the abductor muscles. So one thing that we must keep in mind is that the abductor muscle will be slightly longer than the opponent's muscle. Therefore, it will start below the opponent's muscle. It will start on the scaphoid and the trapezium, inserting further up on the proximal phalanx. So here for the pollicis will be trapezium as well as scaphoid. Now the abductor digiti minimi, again the abductor is a bit longer than opponents. We'll start behind, insert further up. So here we'll have pisiform, then we move on to flexors. So the flexor muscle, it's important to remember that the flexor muscle for the pollicis has two heads. It has a superficial head as well as a deep head. So let's just arrange this. Alright. The superficial head will originate from the flexor retinaculum. The flexor pollicis brevis superficial head will originate on the trapezium and insert on the proximal phalanx. while the deep head will originate on the trapezoid and capitate and insert on the proximal phalanx. So the superficial head originates on trapezium, while the deep head originates on trapezoid and capitate. Now, talking about the flexor digiti minimi. The flexor digiti minimi originates on the hook of the hamate and inserts onto the proximal phalanx. So there's no head here. Now the adductor pollicis. The adductor pollicis also has two heads. It has a transverse head and an oblique head. The transverse head of the adductor pollicis originates on the third metacarpal, inserting onto the proximal phalanx, while the oblique head will originate on the second, third and the capitate bone. So if you notice, it's like a diagonal. It originates on the second, the third and the capitate bone to insert onto the proximal phalanx. So the transverse head is the third metacarpal, oblique head is second and third metacarpal, along with capitate. And finally we have the palmaris brevis, which has the flexor retinaculum as well as the palmar aponeurosis as the origin points and dermis as its insertion point. So this is the most easiest way for you to learn the thenar and the hypothenar muscles. Now let's take a review of how well we remember the thenar and hypothenar muscles by filling out this table right here. So the thenar and hypothenar, first we have the opponents and we have pollicis over here. Here we'll have opponents, digiti minimi. Then we have the flexor pollicis brevis, flexor digiti minimi, the abductor pollicis brevis, abductor digiti minimi. Finally, we have the adductor pollicis and the palmaris brevis. Origin, we'll write flexor retinaculum everywhere. Now, first hypothenar A, abductor not originating from the flexor retinaculum. Abductor does not originate in the hypothenar, therefore abductor of thenar will originate and the adductor will not originate. So we're done with flexor retinaculum. Now the insertion. So everything on top will be proximal phalanx. This will be proximal phalanx. Even adductor is proximal phalanx. Here we have flexor and abductor as the proximal phalanx. Opponents will oppose, therefore it's the metacarpal and the metacarpal here as well, and here we'll have the dermis. Now opponents pollicis, if we remember the carpal bones it will be the trapezium. Okay, just for a recap, let me draw the carpal bones here. This will be scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. So we'll have origin of opponents from the trapezium. Opponent's digita minima will be hamate, that to the hook of hamate. Now we'll talk about the abductor. Abductor is a bit longer than opponents, therefore it will be scaphoid and trapezium. And here the abductor will be longer, so it will be the pisiform. Then we have flexor. Here we'll have the superficial head and the deep head. The superficial head will have the flexor retinaculum, and the superficial head will also have trapezium. Superficial head will also have the trapezium. Then we have the deep head. The deep head will have the capitate and the trapezoid. Capitate, trapezoid. Over here the flexor will be again hook of hamate. Then we have the adductor pollicis, which will have a transverse head and an oblique head. The transverse head will originate on, so here for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Transverse head will originate on the third metacarpal over here. Third metacarpal. Oblique head is second and third metacarpal along with the capitate. So this is like a diagonal. And palmaris brevis originates from flexor retinaculum as well as the palmar aponeurosis. Thenar and hypothenar muscles are memorized. This is done and dusted. Hope this helps you. Thank you.